Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, we are exploring one of the most bizarre political movements in history. It emerged from an ancient empire's symbol of authority and sought to remake the world through a will to power called fascism. Now, fascism, it's even more than a destructive offshoot, which is National Socialism in Germany, i.e., Hitler. Yeah, that's who we're talking about. Almost destroyed the world entirely. You know, some people kind of misunderstand the meaning of the word. Sometimes words can have multiple meanings.
Putting on my historian's hat for a minute, Dr. Weaver, you're absolutely right. The literal term fascist comes from the ancient Roman term fasce. It was a bundle of tied up sticks with an arrow on the bottom that symbolized the authority of one of Caesar's deputies.
Wow.
The term has been somewhat misused, become like communism, sometimes simplified to a term of abuse for people on the left or the right. As George Orwell said, anyone seeking progress can be labeled a communist. Anyone seeking stability can be damned as a fascist. Just as during the first Red Scare in the United States in the early 20s and the McCarthy era in the early 1950s, many people seeking economic stability, peace, or civil rights were damned as Marxist slaves of the Soviet Empire. It is one of the greatest regrets of our time that people tend to oversimplify very complex ideas into slogans and sound bites.
Yeah, well, where did fascism come from? I know the idea of a military dominated society goes back centuries. I mean, Rome glorified warriors, while ancient Greece had the idea of philosopher kings kept in power by a huge army.
Well, some of its principles go back to the early portion of Greece, but there are elements of an absolute government, what's called totalitarianism, in almost any government prior to the 18th century, except for the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. But you were asking specifically about fascism. While the idea of a eugenics program and allowing disabled children to die, that came out of Sparta. That's the negative side of that people. If you want a more positive look at the role of women, look at our Spartan Women podcast. But the political ideas came from two people very prominent in the occult movement in the early 19th century, Madame Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, and Dr. Houston Stewart Chamberlain.
Who were they? These two sound like characters I wouldn't want to meet after dark.
They certainly, you certainly wouldn't have. They were occultic mystics and faith healers, sort of an earlier version of a guru, promoting racial ideas as the key part of their utopia. Chamberlain believed the British Empire and the Second German Reich of the Kaiser's era, dominated by Nordic peoples, were pillars of what he called psychic powers and Aryan light. And the work of the Theosophy founder, Madame Helena Blavatsky, creates the idea of an illuminated people. That's what the term Aryan means in Sanskrit, illuminated. In Blavatsky's mind, these people were mythological figures who lived in the ancient continent of Atlantis. She called these Aryans root races, and they had very similar ideas to what the North Korean people are brainwashed to believe about the Kim family, who also claim root race heritage. They propagated the myth that these Aryans, like the Kims, could fly, raise the dead, didn't have to use the bathroom, and had all sorts of other mystical powers. And the source of their powers came from their racial purity as well as veganism. These dictatorial ideas, despite being right wing, can be used in all sorts of dictatorships. One of my favorite authors, B.R. Myers, in his book, The Cleanest Race, details the use of right wing symbols and methodology by even left wing governments in pursuit of the idea of leader worship. But the specific political modalities used by fascists come out of the chaos after the First World War. People had seen through that war the destruction of the ideal of progress, and they were seeking a return to traditional nationalism and a patriarchal family structure. A new political government idea called a corporate state was created. This is a group where political leaders are replaced by representatives of groups. So you have farmers, business people, manual workers instead of professional politicians, but it's really based on a fear of modernity. The fascists were using modern technology to return to an idealized, non existent past. The idea was that labor unions, big business, and the government would be seen as partners administering a national plan. Now, the purpose of this plan varies from nation to nation. Italy under Mussolini wanted to gain an African colony in Ethiopia and restore the Roman Empire. Romania wants to restore its mythical past. See our Dracula podcast for more details about that. But the origins of the racial obsession which caused the Nazi movement to murder millions and launch a destructive world war didn't exist in a vacuum. Hitler didn't create a lot of his terrible ideas. He expanded and exploited them. It's basically a playbook for any dictator. Now, different types of fascist nations have different unique circumstances. They have different connections with religious groups. Some are atheistic, some are extremely religious. Some have an extreme capitalism. Others have a command economy. There's different attitudes about racism. The Nazis take that to an extreme, but Italian fascists welcome Jews and people of non-Nordic backgrounds. Croatia links that. They're dictated to the Catholic Church. The Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo deifies the last Chinese emperor, while the Nazis fight against most forms of Christianity and seek to first enslave and then destroy the Jewish people entirely in favor of both a Nordic paganism, corruption of a great idea, and the Gnostic so-called German faith movement. Now, this German faith movement was a bastardization, a mixture of racial dogma, magic, and a perversion of the medieval Cathar movement, which basically held that Jesus Christ was at war with the creator God.
Hmm. Sounds like Zeus and Kronos in Greek mythology. Hmm. These ideas are very different from most types of spirituality. They're seeming to kind of militarize faith. This is contrary to most every spiritual and democratic principles. And I know that one thing all versions of this relatively new political idea had was an obsession with youth. Okay, the mobilization of youth in the name of a universal goal is a key factor in the fascist worldview. In Germany, this took the form of the Hitler Youth, led by Baldur von Schirach in Germany, the Italian Della Provavo After Work Association, under El Duce's son in law, Count Ciano, offered everything from free bocce tickets to interest free government loans and even the Civilian Conservation Corps in the USA under the New Deal, created to combat unemployment, employed military discipline. CCC camp members wore standard clothing, just sort of like a Catholic school, huh? Lived under military discipline. Again, interesting that we see replications of that in other things like Catholic schools. Called instructors, sir. and were paid $30 a month, of which 22 went to their families as room and board, to rebuild the country. Now, many reform programs designed to combat the Depression, even in democratic countries, adopted some fascist modalities. This is highlighted in Jonah Goldberg's Liberal Fascism and Wolfgang Seebach's Three New Deals, reflections on Roosevelt's America, Hitler's Germany, and Mussolini's Italy. All three nations wanted to identify the country with their leader. As Seibelbach explains, the leader's interactions through the media, press, and radio during this period was a daily visit from an idealized father figure and bestower of gifts. Those in compliance with government programs were rewarded, and those who didn't get on board were first socially ostracized and then, in his words, punished.
Gaining obedience and loyalty from the masses was not always an easy task. In all of these societies, a complex series of rewards and punishments was put in place. The Nazis, for example, created the Beauty of Labor program to provide non-cash benefits for workers: music, free lunches, swimming pools on a job site, the Autobahn, a wonderful German idea that was adopted by President Eisenhower in the United States to promote travel, and government subsidized vacations through what was called the Strength Through Joy program under the German Labor Front. This was the carrot at the Third Reich for people of the right racial background. Sticks were ranging from job loss to assignment to a prison work camp as what was called a work-shy antisocial unworthy of membership in the race. The American government, being part of a democratic society, took a more incentivizing approach, subsidizing artists under the Federal Theater Project and the National Youth Authority. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, check out our wonderful podcast about her, built a model town for unemployed coal miners in West Virginia called Arthurdale to combine industrial and agricultural work and engage in joint enterprises to both educate and help workers produce. Because the United States did not become a dictatorship, the consequences of not joining up with government programs were not imprisonment, but the loss of government contracts rather than the harsher methods of the future Axis powers. Italian shirkers were exiled to penal islands, while the cooperative received baby bonuses, free dental care, and the opportunity to be decorated by King Victor Emmanuel III, becoming members of the so-called black nobility, people with titles who were not born with and did not possess aristocratic backgrounds. I have already mentioned the fasce symbol from Italy, but the other two governments had a unique symbol. The National Recovery Act in the United States had its blue eagle. The Philadelphia Eagles football team is actually named for that, and the slogan, "We do our part." In Germany, an original good luck symbol, a Native American peace badge, became the most evil representative symbol in the 20th century. The so-called swastika had a long positive history as a symbol of good luck and Asian culture.
The Navajo, the Native Americans in Navajo, had used the swastika as a symbol of good luck and peace. The literal meaning of the word is su, meaning good, and tika, to be. So it means to be good. Even the Honor Society of the Boy Scouts of America, the Order of the Arrow, which, yes, I went through, and I know, Dr. Deneen, you did too, used this symbol in the early 30s. After it became associated with the Nazis, many people removed it from books and banners. The director of the French school at Athens, Emilion Brunoff, wrote to Schleiermacher in 1872, stating the swastika should be regarded as a sign of the Aryan race as far back as the Middle Ages. The swastika, that happened all over the world. And, it's sometimes thought of by some, and even has been said that it was bending the cross, which was, I haven't found any evidence that that's true. I think it's not true. The Finns, they adopted that as a good luck charm prior to their alliance with Nazi Germany. And you can check out our podcast on political deals with the devil to explore that further. So, the swastika, which has become a universal symbol of hate and domination, was really once understood to be a representation of hope and peace throughout the world. Okay, now we have some background on this topic. We can focus on the presence and impact of neo-Nazi, fascists, and other hate groups in the USA. First, it is important to realize that there are more of these groups in the USA than any other country in the world. The number of these groups is reported as anywhere between 1,500 and 2,500 plus.
I can scarcely believe that, although I know you're accurate. That's a disturbingly high number of people and groups, especially when we examine the central beliefs of neo-Nazi and fascist groups, including racial superiority, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. Why do you think that's the case?
In my opinion, there was a kind of a perfect storm of events which ramped up psychological, economic, and nationalistic issues. The Great Depression, which was fueled by an overextended and inflationary economic environment, was made worse by trade problems, and this forced an economic downturn never before seen in the USA. At the same time, communism emerged as a powerful ideologic factor which terrified many in the USA. Socialism, which had been around as far back as the 19th century and maybe before that, also brought some pressure to the situation with the contradictory notion of no personal property and a completely level playing field. The emergence of fascism, with its promise to end all problems with anti-democratic, anti-communist, and anti-liberal and nationalistic stances, added an enticing, at least to some conservatives, alternative. And need to say here that, again, in my opinion, all three forms of government just mentioned are fraught with problems. Communism sounds great on paper. It really does. But simply cannot work in any long term sense because it goes against human nature and is set up to invest power and control in the hands of a few people. Fascism moves even closer to total dictatorial government, which is doomed to failure as it depends on a completely homogeneous populace, which means that all decisions will be based on one set of ideas, inevitably leading to poor decisions. I mean, you can't make decisions without seeing all the sides because you'll mess up. You will mess up. Capitalism, while great at getting economies started, is also flawed because it quickly devolves due to unrestrained corporate greed, ignoring individual rights and freedoms by virtue of a kind of what I would call economic enslavement.
If I may say so, you left out socialism. The difficulty with that, in my opinion, is that a society with an absolutely level playing field, which is basically impossible, in which all workers earn the same, would tend to stifle initiative. A world in which a physician only earned as much as a bartender would have no incentive for hard work, and progress. Perhaps the greatest political and social task is to find a compromise which allows for individual achievement and autonomy, and at the same time provides floor, safety net, and benefit to the masses. That's perhaps the most important task of the next century.
The radicals on each side that are actively, active currently in the United States are causing a great deal of harm to our society. Absolute socialism would probably bring our economy to a halt. It would. Yet there are those who are pushing for that kind of system. We saw the contribution Hoover made as president in that light, as well as FDR not handling that legacy much better. And it resulted in, the Great Depression and a real skewing of thought in many ways.
In the same vein, we've seen the outcome of communism, which has repeatedly failed, stagnated economies to the point the people struggle with subsistence living. Yet again, there are still groups that support that cause.
Indeed. Fascism, unfortunately, has a very strong following in the USA, despite all the historical evidence showing that it ultimately does not work, especially as it works towards a totalitarian government. In other words, all the power, all the control is lodged in one person. How can that work out? They're not going to think of everyone in their country. They're just not. Doesn't happen.
It would be and has been a disaster. Also, unbridled nationalism, which is rampant in some circles, has an appeal to some people because it's cloaked as pride in one's country and just looking out for the best interests of one nation. The problem is that there is a tendency to regard one's own society as the source of all good. If Americans were not open to the ideas of other countries, even something as pleasant and ubiquitous as Christmas trees wouldn't exist. That was a German idea. The other danger is xenophobia and groupthink. One of my favorite authors, Robert Harris, in his novel Archangel, explains the danger of this kind of belief. Americans think because a country accepts credit cards and has McDonald's, that it's the same as their own, with no regards for its culture, history, or belief. It is a dangerous game to attempt to reshape the world.
Mm-hmm. More to the focus of this podcast, neo Nazi, hate groups, and other fascist groups are very active in the United States. What am I talking about? Groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and Nazi groups use all manner of social media outlets to promote their causes and recruit members who then fall prey to groupthink and become very radicalized. Now, what is groupthink? Just very briefly here. When you join a group, your natural tendency is to try and become tighter in that group, higher in it, more respected and whatnot. And the way you do that is by becoming more radical, more in the way that they think. And that's what happens in groupthink, particularly in these kind of things. It's not enough that I'm going to own a gun, a right that's secured in our Constitution, but that you're going to prepare to use it like a little militia, but without the kinds of controls that usually goes with that in an organized militia. Now, I also understand that there are a lot of people who will vehemently disagree with the following statement, and I take sole responsibility for making them. Many do not recognize that the slogan, "Make America Great Again," is a direct slogan Hitler used. Adolf Hitler. Uh huh. Although when Hitler said it, he said, "Make Germany great again." The APA, the Professional Organization for Psychologists and Psychiatrists, has said a great deal about this topic. And I agree with them in saying that Trump is a megalomaniac, and directing the January 6th insurrection attack was a prime example of his problem. We've seen many examples of this dangerous group of people who share this kind of ideology. Unfortunately, Hitler lives on by his words and by his principles.
Friends, I think the idea that we can explore this topic and any other controversial topic is openly is the essence of what it means to be free. Every person follows their own heart, their reason, and their conscience. And I hope this podcast, like many of our others, will create respectful debate and individual research and exploration. Make up your own minds, friends. Many wonderful topics are coming up on this podcast, and it's really been a joy and an intellectual exercise to be a part of it. Looking forward to seeing you soon.
Indeed. And hey, while you're at it, click that reminder bell so you can be notified when when we come up with some new stuff, which we are. We have several things coming. And leave us a comment if you'd like. We'd be happy to see them. And we would sure appreciate a like. So until next time, bye bye.